Hello. My name is Marcia Scott. I'm chief exec. I see somebody waving. Hello, Isabel. Welcome to Scottish Women's Aid's first annual external conference since before COVID. We're excited and nervous because we got a lot of people on an online conference, and we know that there will be absolutely no tech problems. I just completely lied. So right from the start, we need to ask everybody to turn their cameras and their mics off because the thing that we set up to do that automatically didn't work. So if you would mind not doing that, and we might remind people occasionally because I think if anybody's like me, they'll show up in about 5 or 10 minutes. So I will, I'm just going to do a few minutes because if I do more than a few minutes, I'm in big trouble, to welcome everybody to this conference and to set a little bit of a context, I guess. It was well over 5 years ago that Scottish Women's Aid and Assist co-hosted a meeting to talk about the fact that Scotland did not have a domestic homicide review process, unlike England and Wales. And what were we going to do? Should we do something about this gap? And if we should do something, what we should do? And attendees at that meeting included the head of justice at Scottish Government. We had a judge. We had representatives from Police Scotland. We had expert review chairs from England who were reviewing DHRs then. And it was a really helpful and good meeting in which we agreed two things. One is it was not acceptable that Scotland wasn't reviewing domestic abuse killings, and that we needed a particularly Scottish model, that adopting the one from down south was not a good way forward for many reasons. Like I said, that was over 5 years ago, and next to nothing has happened since then. And there has been some progress. The Scottish Government has put the development of a DHR process into the Equally Safe Delivery Plan, which is a great step forward, but unfortunately very little has happened to develop a Scottish model or to implement one. And so in the intervening 5 years, well over 50 women, children, and men experiencing domestic abuse have undoubtedly lost their lives. Many of those deaths, those killings, would have been preventable. So today's conference is committed to moving the conversation on, but more importantly, setting the groundwork for action. And we are dedicating the conference to those who have lost their lives in domestic abuse killings since that first meeting, and to those women and children who are living in fear today. This conference is in your name. I'm now going to hand over to my co-host, who's delighted that I made it in my time scale, co-chair, co-host, I sound like we're a television show, co-chair to Jody McVicker, the most wonderful training manager an organization could possibly have.
Thank you so much, Marcia. I just want to say how excited I am to see the massive interest and enthusiasm in the attendance of this conference. So many people from across various areas of the sector. It's absolutely amazing to see that there's so many people committed to looking further into domestic abuse killings. It's a given that none of us here think that it's okay that women and children are dying, that they're being killed by domestic abuse. And I feel like together, collaborating together, we have a real opportunity now to come together and, like Marcia said, move this conversation forward, move this forward so that we can create a model for Scotland that is really going to address domestic abuse killings, right from the awareness to the prevention to the proper investigation and review of that. First, it's about understanding that domestic abuse killings are absolutely underpinned by that wider pattern of coercive control, that they are preventable, that there's massively clear signs of them. We're going to hear about that from some of the research today and what we can do about that. And we're also going to hear about not just women, but also children that are killed directly and indirectly, and what those indirect deaths look like. We're going to hear from David Mandel about that in more detail and how we can efficiently incorporate reviews about child deaths from domestic abuse as well. And we'll also learn about the hidden domestic abuse killings of women and children, ones that don't show up in the statistics, as well as thinking about the many BME women, Scottish women, that are killed abroad and then because of domestic abuse, and it's reported back as car accidents or poisoning or something else. There's so many women and children that are losing their lives, and it's how we can stop this happening, because it is unacceptable. So what I'm going to do is we're going to play a video from Keith Brown, who is the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Veterans, just to frame the conference. We've not got any sound there, Judy?
I can't hear anything.
Yeah, we're just going to get that back in a wee second. Gosh, that was... Right, we still can't hear that, Judy. I'll try sharing it from mine's. Right, these are just some of these technical difficulties that we were talking about that can happen with these things. Give me a wee second.
If you've just joined us, if you could turn your video off and make sure your mic's off, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you. Just give us 2 seconds. Teams is not as efficient at these things as Zoom is.
I want to send my best wishes to
Can people hear
everyone
that?
taking part in today's Scottish Women's Aid Conference.
Yes. Yes.
The focus for this event,
Yep.
how we prevent domestic abuse killings, is an issue of huge importance, and it's one which the Scottish Government is determined to address. That's why, for example, we continue to place so much emphasis on our Tackling Violence Against Women strategy, Equally Safe. It's why we're investing heavily through the Equally Safe Fund in early intervention and prevention, as well as support services. And it's also why, as part of the strategy, we are committed to developing a Scottish approach to domestic homicide reviews. And these reviews are not about finger pointing or apportioning blame. Instead, they're about increasing transparency and learning lessons which will help us save women's lives. It's essential that we get this right. So as we develop the model for Scotland, we are continuing to work closely with the relevant agencies and with partners like Scottish Women's Aid. At the same time, we're taking account of the different approaches used in the UK and around the world. And we're also determined to listen to the views of those who have been affected by domestic homicide. Today's conference is a great way of bringing these different perspectives together. It's an opportunity to share a range of expertise, ideas, as well as lived experience from around the world. And I'm sure the discussions will be hugely valuable in informing the approach that Scotland takes. So I'm very grateful to all of you for taking part today. I'd like to thank Scottish Women's Aid for all the work they're doing to raise awareness of this issue. And I hope the event will help all of us in our efforts to prevent domestic homicide, and to protect the lives of women across the country.
So that was good to hear from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice there. Just a bit by way of introduction about what we want to achieve from the conference. So what we want is to look at, like I say, that awareness raising, the prevention, but also that when we look at a model for domestic homicide reviews, how we can avoid some of the problems that we see in other areas. So that kind of victim blaming, not fully involving families, information from services, or the review process being impacted by turnover for staff, taking a really long time. So when we hear from presenters today, we really want to think about how can we get a model for Scotland that will really work across all these areas. Because we know that these deaths are preventable. So we're going to hear now from our first speaker. So we're going to hear from Fiona Drouet, who's the mum of Emily Drouet. So Fiona is the founder and chief executive of the Scottish charity Emily Test. So 18 years of age, Fiona's daughter Emily took her own life after being subjected to a relentless campaign of physical, psychological and sexual abuse by a fellow student while at university. Emily's death was the result of a series of preventable failures, and we're going to hear a little bit more about those and what we can learn from that and how we can use that going forward. Fiona subsequently worked tirelessly to tackle gender-based violence. A lot of people will have heard from her before, but there'll be a lot of people here today that haven't heard from Fiona. So she's going to talk to us about how we can work together to address and prevent all domestic abuse related deaths of women and children and young people. So Fiona, I'll hand over to you if you're ready.
Thanks so much, Jodie. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really hoping I don't let the side down with the technology, so just bear with me while I share my screen with you all. Just a second. Can somebody just say out loud if they can see that, please?
Not yet.
You can. Thank you. So yeah, as
No,
Jodie
we
was
can't
saying,
see it, Fiona.
you can't.
No.
Ah, okay.
We
It's
can also
okay.
see you.
Ah, okay. That's not good. Let me just see. There we go. I realised the mistake.
You know, no matter how many times we all do this, it's just always clumsy.
Yeah, 2 seconds, and I should be able to get us there now. Hold on a second. It's not easy. I am a big fan of Zoom as well, so but I think that's us here now. So my apologies. Can everyone see that now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Thank you. My apologies. So yeah, my name's Fiona Drouet, and as I was just introduced, I'm founder of a charity that has been formed to tackle gender-based violence in education. But I'm just here today to, obviously this is I just want to say I'm really privileged to get this opportunity to speak today. This is a subject that's very close to our hearts, and I just want to tell you a wee bit more about why it impacts us as a family. So first of all, I want to introduce you to my beautiful daughter, Emily, that you can see on the screen. Just one of the most amazing and wonderful daughters that any mum could ever be blessed with, apart from my other daughter, and I always have to add that in. She was always so incredibly kind, full of life, just an amazing girl, so loving, never judgmental, and I always really liked that about Emily, not looking for drama and things, so I think that can be quite rare. And she loved sports like skiing and sailing, running, and a great talent for music, really good at the clarinet, even although she tried to lose it on the bus on every day on her journey home from school. But she loved baking. She was always surprising us with buffet breakfasts and weekend mornings. Just family was everything to Emily. And as a family unit, we've always been really, really close. You can see her with her brother and sister there. She was always spoiling them. She loved taking them for the Starbucks and things. And it was in 2015, September 2015, that Emily left to study law. Sorry, I'll hide that because I can see that's probably interfering with the screen. And she went to study at a university that was a few hours away from our home here in Glasgow. And she was only 17 years old. A really exciting time for her. Obviously, we were nervous about it, thinking, should we let her go? But you cannot stop your child from fulfilling their dreams. And so obviously, as supportive parents, we supported Emily in her journey of going to study law at university. The big move came, and you can see on the screen at the right-hand side, that's us moving Emily into her room at the Halls. And we went with 2 big cars jam-packed full of all her things, all of her clothes and her makeup, and left her to settle in, met some of the members of the other families, and everything seemed fine. And then the next day we went back to give her a big hug before we drove back to Glasgow. And I can always remember Emily's her desperation as she patted my back, trying to stop me crying in front of all of her new friends at uni. But uni life seemed to be everything it should be. She was loving it. She was flourishing, making loads of new friends, sending me selfies, partying. Yes, probably more than we knew, as you can see, but that's it. It's life as a student, and it was all looking great. Emily was just growing into the stunning, kind and warm young woman that we always knew she would be, and our hearts were bursting with pride. That was until Emily met someone called Angus Milligan. He was a couple of years older than everyone else, although also in his first year. And he'd seen a photo of Emily in her school uniform. It was a themed night out for law, and said, "I'm having her tonight." That night, he began showering Emily with his charm. A charm that people said oozed from him. He was friendly, he was a really great guy, and they started a relationship which grew intense. Obviously, they're in the halls, no parents there to nag them or to say, like, maybe you should have less time together. But all seemed okay. They saw each other over the Christmas holidays, and that's when we met him for the first time. I wasn't sure of him at all, and I want to, add to that I'm not a judgmental person. It was just something I felt really uncomfortable around him. I found him really quite self-assured, but very arrogant with it, and I put it down to me being that overly protective mum, and I just tried to ignore it. And Emily said he was just a friend anyway. She visited him in Edinburgh over the Christmas holidays, and I remember I collected her from Queen Street Station one day, and she came running over to the car, all bouncy, full of smiles and excitement. And I said, "I'm guessing it was a nice day," and she said yes, and she was really excited. And I did say, "Emily, there's something I'm just not sure about with him." I was trying to be gentle with her. And she said, "Mummy, I'll have you know, when we were standing on the platform waiting for the train, he took me by the face and said, 'You're the most gorgeous, incredibly beautiful and stunning girl I've ever seen.'" And I thought that was lovely for her. I could see she was beaming with pride, she was loving the attention, and like most young girls would, and I was happy for her. But I said to her, "Just be careful, Emily, because actions speak louder than words." And why I said that, well, I know now, but it was just a subconscious feeling that I had about him. What Emily didn't know is that while she was falling in love and all gooey for him, he was sleeping with other girls on various nights out in Edinburgh. And Emily found that out when they went back to university in January, and her heart was absolutely broken. She was falling for him really quickly, like most young girls would. She stopped seeing him for a while, but he convinced her to get back together with his rule that it wasn't a relationship because they should sleep with other people. That's what everyone does at uni. Nobody has a relationship. So Emily just went along with it. She did go to end the relationship again mid-January, and he said, "Oh, don't end it just now, Emily. I've already got your birthday present," because her birthday, her 18th birthday, was at the end of January. And Emily didn't need big extravagant gifts, but her gift wasn't something she would have expected, like maybe flowers, chocolates, something simple like that. It was £200 of Anne Summers sex toys and restraints. And the relationship was getting darker. He continually hounded Emily to sleep with his friends from the rugby club. She told her friends that she thought it was creepy, but they thought, well, maybe it's just, this is how it is. They didn't want to say too much about it. They were all really young. A lot of virgins amongst them didn't want to stand out as the virgins on campus either. He introduced her to sexual practices that were both violent and really dangerous. And one night she went to see him and he told her to go away, only come back once you've had sex with, and then said the name of one of his friends. He sent her texts detailing the sizes of all of their penises, telling which one would be perfect. And again, this was all down to just a wee bit of a laugh with him. Another night she came home to her, well, when she came home, I say, went back to her flat in the halls of residence. and one of his friends was in the flat, in her room, refusing to get out. He was in her bed, saying that Emily had to have sex with him before he would leave. She went through and locked herself in the room next door. Her friends said he would text Emily and she would jump right away. We later found he was sending her counting down timers, telling her she had 2 minutes to get there or he'd take the key back in from the window ledge. And that's me using mild language, no language at all really. He showed her an email he had written detailing her bad behaviour about drinking, parties, sex, and threatened to send it to me if she didn't change her behaviour and act the way that he felt she should. And I never got that email, and I only wish I had. I always wonder if Emily felt being with him was the only way she could manage the situation. It was like it was safer, because if this was what he did when he loved her, what would it be like if he really truly hated her? She was going out to clubs wherever he was because she knew if she didn't, he'd sleep with someone else and she would hear all of the details. And one night he put Emily's hand into the hand of one of the friends he had told her to have sex with. They were in a club. Emily said she didn't want to go, she wanted to stay with Angus, but he encouraged her to go. And to protect Emily, it's only right to say that she was really drunk. She said several times she couldn't remember getting taken into the taxi and was blacking out. And what happened that night is not something she wanted, but sadly, we're not allowed to talk about it because of legal reasons. Just suffice to say, there are many disturbing unanswered questions surrounding what happened. Although he'd been planning Emily being with this particular friend and told her to go with him, he stood in the courtyard and screamed, "Slut, whore, fucking cunt. Emily Drouet from flat 86B is a fucking slag." He also screamed details of their sex life, saying what Emily had done to him and what he had done to her, making Emily feel worthless to the point where she didn't want to leave her room. She hid in her room in darkness below the window so that people couldn't see. The texts poured in, and these ones are mild, and Emily tried to calm him down and talk to him. She stayed in her room more and more because she was scared of confrontation. And one thing that breaks my heart is her friend saying that one day when they were going to go out, they were going to go to the key store, and Emily said, "Can I come with you, Sophie? Don't worry, I'll put my hood up. No, 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 it's me you're with." She felt she was someone that people would be ashamed to be seen with. She started to say to friends that she realised he was bad and that she was staying away. And she even put a tweet on, which I didn't see at the time, and it was a wee hand emoji hand saying, "Why your mum's always right about boys." But 7 days after all of this had started, he barged into Emily's room and attacked her so viciously that she feared for her life. He took her by the throat, he slammed Emily's head down on her desk, and he choked her until she thought she was going to die, until she came to passing out. He left her on the floor, rocking back and forward, injured and clearly distressed, and then walked out back over to his flat, which was across the road, and laughed about it to his friends, telling them how he'd slap her every time she dared to lie to him or looked away. Disturbingly, he found abusing our daughter highly entertaining. And no, not one of his friends spoke out against what he had done. None of them ever went to check on her. They all supported him. That night, Emily went to the university for support. They saw she was injured and asked if he had hit her, and Emily, in true style, said, "No, I don't want to get him into trouble." They then walked outside for a while, and the report was written, and I'm quoting from the report. "Emily came to us concerned about her angry and aggressive boyfriend. Emily feels she's hitting the self-destruct button. Emily knows she needs to change her behaviour. No follow-up required." Emily was then sent back to her room on her own, with her abuser remaining in his flat that looked straight onto hers. She told her friends how scared she was, how she'd seen stars, she thought she was going to die. And she said to one friend in a text, "I'm so scared, I think I want to die." Over the following 7 days, Milligan visited Emily unannounced a further 3 times. And on the 17th of March 2016, as Emily was preparing for St. Patrick's Night, Milligan entered her room unannounced yet again, and he left 4 minutes later. Emily ran out to the flat next door. She was screaming and crying. She was hysterical. And she told the friend that he's been in, he's pushed me around again, put his hands round my throat. I can't go on. She was hysterical. She left that flat and came back to her room alone. She then texted her friend saying that she thinks, I don't think I can go out anymore, Caitlin. He's been in and he's really angry. Her friend said, I'll be there in 10 minutes. A friend arrived 10 minutes after Emily's last text was sent on her phone. She knocked Emily's door, but there was no answer. She called Emily's phone, but Emily's phone rang out. Scared, broken, and all alone, our little girl had taken her own life. I think everybody will be able to see the failures that had happened at university level and on many levels in Emily's case. And there's much work we've been doing, so including support cards in universities, instilling minimum standards through our GBV charter in universities and colleges, and risk assessment processes for universities and colleges, basically a layperson's risk assessment so that they get people to much needed safety. But I don't want to focus too long on all of that today because I want to embrace a rare opportunity to talk specifically about suicides with domestic abuse preceding them. It was 1:30 a.m. in the morning of the 18th of March when we answered the door to 2 police officers. We invited them in completely unaware that our world was about to implode. They sat us down and asked, is your daughter Emily studying at the University of Aberdeen? And I only remember desperately urging them to say what had happened, even although it was just a split second that had passed. It felt like an eternity before they would tell me what had happened. They then said Emily had been found. And my immediate reaction, the first thing I said, she's been murdered. Not because I knew of any abuse, we didn't know of anything that was going on at university, but because it's your worst fear when your child finds newfound independence and you're not there to protect them all the time. But suicide, Emily taking her own life. She never had any mental health issues in her life. She had the usual struggles that teenagers have, but nothing of significance. Our happy, amazing, bubbly little girl with the world at her feet and a family who adored her was gone. How could she take her own life? None of it made sense. Nothing made sense to us at all. But only hours later, we started finding out about what had been happening to Emily at university. And still today, we're still finding out more horrific details of the pain she was subjected to. Details that I can't even share 6 years on because we are still seeking justice. It was a challenge enough to get a criminal investigation off the ground as she was initially written off by police as a young girl who's gone to university. She's obviously struggling to make friends. We see her 2 or 3 of these a week, Mrs. Drouet. We had the Procurator Fiscal say to us, it's clear it was an unloving relationship, one in which Emily was very much the victim, but she kept going back. And I'm sure you can imagine what my response to that was. But we fought hard. We familiarised ourselves with the law. Even in all of this grief, we knew this wasn't right. We met with people that we needed to, experts, professionals, such as Women's Aid. And we made our own case and thankfully reached police officers that understood domestic abuse. Milligan was eventually found guilty of common assault, breach of the Communications Act and stalking. A grand total of 180 hours community service reduced for an early plea. But that's as far as our criminal laws go. Where's the recognition of the impact of his abuse on Emily? The physical but also psychological damage she sustained, being strangled to the point she thought that was it, she was going to die. Belittled, sexually assaulted, humiliated at every turn, blackmailed, and then on top of that made to fear if you don't conform, you'll lose your one constant, Emily, your family. Every time she was picking herself back up, he was there waiting to make sure that she fell again, each time weakening her resolve. We talk of resilience, but how resilient do you need to be to survive what can only be described as complete torture? Domestic abuse is determined and deliberate, and it takes more people than we know to the point they feel suicide is the only escape, the only way for the pain to stop. And everyone here knows abusers have unfaltering determination. They don't have limits. Emily was facing this each and every day, yet although we now understand more about the psychological impacts, the law isn't catching up quickly enough. It does understand the psychological impacts, but not as far as suicide goes. To be more specific, culpable homicide, an act which has resulted in a person's death, but is held not to amount to murder. Emily matters, as do so many other lives. They deserve better. We claim to be a civilised society, so surely our laws must reflect that. Show people the matter, create laws that show destruction by abuse is not okay. After all, if we don't, what message are we sending back out to society? What are we normalising? What are we accepting? And what risks remain for others? Like many other broken or bereaved families, we've been forced to seek justice through the civil courts, holding Milligan liable for Emily's suicide. And yes, we're exhausted. Yes, the process feels like abuse is continuing through that process, but we'll never give up. Emily was and is a wonderful, gifted, amazing young woman who had a full and happy life ahead of her, but her life was cut short by somebody's persistent abuse on her. And we'll fight until we have no breath left. We'll fight with our aching hearts to make sure this doesn't happen again. Thank you for listening to me today.
Oh, Fiona, thank you. And everything that we do and say today, we hope will prevent more Emilys. Thank you so much for your work and for your being with us today. What a wonderful young woman she is, and what an incredible mother you are. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to move us ahead, although it's quite difficult to move on from that. But just in the interest of the work that we need to do today, I'm very delighted to take on the task of introducing Jane Moncton Smith. I'm first of all going to apologize for all the admittings to the lobby. We should have turned that off at the beginning, but we can't seem to do it now. So yeah, yep, more learning for us. I see a hand up from somebody. We won't be taking any comments or questions, I'm afraid. So, but if you hear something or see something that you want to talk about or challenge, or talk to one of the presenters about, send us an email and we will promise to pass it on after the conference. So I'm going to introduce Jane Moncton Smith. Jane is a professor of public protection at the University of Gloucestershire. She has done amazing work in the field. She's authored a new theoretical framework for tracking homicide risk in cases of domestic abuse and stalking, and her wider body of work is acknowledged as having really societal-wide impact and influence, and is described as outstanding and innovative. In addition to academic work, she maintains a wide portfolio of professional and casework, including chairing statutory domestic homicide reviews with Scotland, obviously, providing investigative support on current and cold homicide cases, training professionals in risk and threat assessment, and providing risk assessment in current cases, of coercive control and stalking. And Jane, you are so very welcome, and we are so very grateful that you are joining us. And before you start, can I just ask Lynn McKenzie to turn your camera off? Thank you. And Jane, the floor is yours, or the frame is yours, I guess I should say.
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is see if the technology is going to work. I did last time.
Famous last words.
Famous last words, yeah. Can you see my slides?
No, we saw them for a sec. Oh,
Yeah,
there we go.
that's
Yeah,
fine.
now we got them.
Ah, we're there. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Fiona for sharing our story. We have spoken before, and you were very, very helpful in the research that we did into domestic abuse related suicide, which I am going to talk about today. So thank you so much for that. I think one of the things, I'm going to talk about some of the work that we have been doing. There are so many people in so many places doing amazing work. I can't believe that most of this work isn't impacting on our policy and practice. So awareness raising remains, of course, one of the most crucial things that we can do to get the messages out there. One of the key messages that I think is really important and is mentioned as, you know, driving this conference is about the scale of the issue, and how we do not recognise what the scale of the issue truly is, and how we should be recording and counting all of these deaths, so that when we really do realise the scale of this, somebody maybe might do something who has the power to do it. So this graph that I've got here is something that we produced when we did our hidden homicides, or we're still doing our hidden homicides research. We're just writing it up at the moment. One of the things that we realised was that only a very small number of the sudden or unexpected deaths that are directly related to domestic abuse are counted. Now, the bar in the middle of this graph is largely what the government in England and Wales anyway acknowledge or identify as homicides. That's around 100, 130 deaths a year. But those are the deaths that are identified as suspicious. The last bar there, I've put suicide underneath it. Now, this is deaths of women specifically. Those are not all of the suicide deaths. Those are the suicide deaths that we estimate are directly related to domestic abuse. And you can see that figure is staggering. The third column is what we call hidden homicides. So those are deaths that are considered suspicious by families or friends, or sometimes agencies and the criminal justice system, but are not acknowledged as such, not recorded. Perhaps there's been no investigation whatsoever. Now, that figure, as you can imagine, was so difficult to estimate because we don't count those deaths. If somebody dies not by suicide and not by an identified homicide, that death isn't really recorded anywhere. So where do you even start to estimate the scale of the issue? So we did work with a journalist who put out some freedom of information requests to all 43 police forces in England and Wales, and asked them, how many deaths have you recorded that are directly related to domestic abuse or stalking or coercive control? Well, as you can imagine, hardly any of those police forces were recording or counting such deaths, but there were some. And there was one force in particular that said they had recorded around 5 a year. If we extrapolate that across all 43 forces, we get a figure of around 129 deaths. We into this conclusion, we put the work that we had been doing with families who were suspicious and trying to get the police to act, and also charities like Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, and we came up with this figure, which is actually more than the figure for, you know, identified homicides, which I think is a terrifying thing, because this doesn't even count, you know, those deaths where women are made homeless and, you know, things like that, and they might die through ill health. This is suspicious deaths that have not been investigated. So if you put all of those figures together, we're not talking about 2 women a week. We're talking 10, 15, even maybe 20 women a week. And that is a terrifying figure. I do put in the caveat that, you know, the only firm figure we can have is the identified homicides. The rest is, you know, largely unscientific, but because we don't count, we don't know. And if we don't know, perhaps we can't argue. But I would say those figures are pretty on the nose. Because of finding all those figures, we did have a campaign recently, which we called the Not Just Another campaign, which was really widely supported in Scotland. And that is a page from, I think it's called the Post. In Scotland, they did like 3 or 4 page spread on the problem of not counting domestic abuse related deaths. So, you know, and Women's Aid were really helpful in supporting us in that campaign. But there hasn't been a huge amount of action since then, but we've made inroads and they are talking about it, at least at the higher levels. The context in which all of this happens, which I think is really important as well, is coercive control and the language of coercive control. You know, largely criminalised now, and criminalised for good reason. Criminalised because it is the most significant predictor of a future homicide or suicide. We absolutely know that. It's a bigger predictor than violence. So, you know, everything sits in the context of looking at coercive control, looking at the behavioural patterns. It is certainly where we focus our research, looking at the behavioural patterns of coercive controlling abusers and tracking how those behavioural patterns can be used to show how things might be escalating, how and why they might be escalating. It's also, I think, interesting to look at some recent attention that has been paid in the criminal justice system to these problems. So there was a case, it's called the Moncton case, 2021, where the chief coroner made it clear that you can reach a conclusion of a suspicious death to the civil standard, whereas before it was assumed to be, or was, the criminal standard. So we have just pulled this back down to, rather than beyond reasonable doubt, we've got it on the balance of probabilities, which I think is going to make it easier to start identifying these suspicious deaths, perhaps within the coronial process, before it can then, that may, we're hoping, push the criminal process to sit up and listen if the coroners are saying this is suspicious. Notwithstanding the problems with our domestic homicide reviews, and there are many problems with them, in 2016 the Home Office did put into the guidance for homicide review chairs that domestic abuse related suicides should also be reviewed, and that is starting to happen, but it is a slow process, and community safety partnerships are resisting in many cases commissioning reviews for suicides. We've obviously made our call to start counting the deaths, and you know that has been taken up by some MPs as well. There was a tortoise investigation as well. They've done 2, in fact. They did one on hidden homicides, and then they further went, and you can look at the podcast, and the podcasts are worth a listen, where they looked at specifically suspicious fall deaths that were related to domestic abuse. And there were even conversations around, you know, a potential public inquiry into hidden homicides and why they weren't being investigated by the police. And to go back to something that Fiona was saying, there has been in England and Wales the first conviction for causing the suicide death of a woman called Justine Rees. Now, he was charged with manslaughter, but the thing was he pleaded guilty, so that gave a conviction. So that means that precedent has been set that we can potentially charge people with manslaughter when somebody has taken their own life. The only thing was, I think, with that case, is that because he pleaded guilty, it wasn't tested in the court how the jury would actually respond to that. But with awareness, I think we can even start infiltrating jury thinking. And certainly Fiona's story, like many others, I think leaves very little doubt as to what happened. So I'm just going, in the context of all of that, I'm just going to talk about the research that we've done into risk escalation patterns and how consistent they are, and how we can use these risk escalation patterns, or what we are calling timelines, to track how the risk is escalating. And these have been used in criminal trials, they've been used in the coronial process, and they're being used in civil trials, and they're also being used in safeguarding for victims who still have their lives. So the first one is probably one that you may have heard of, and this is basically the intimate partner homicide timeline. And those 8 stages there are the risk escalation stages. So as you go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3, there is an exponential rise in risk to the victim that they may be seriously harmed, or there may be an attempt on their life. And that piece of research has actually had a huge amount of impact, because it has taken a very forensic approach to domestic abuse, which I think is really lacking. We still have this problem where we're talking about domestic abuse as if it's a couple problem or a crime of passion, or somebody had an argument and just went too far. Well, these behavioural pattern timelines completely undermine that narrative. And we know from all of the research that has come in across the world, really, over the last decades, they have been talking about patterns for years and years and years, and that these things are not about arguments. Hopefully, at least if we have these models for timelines, I think one of the important things they can do is to say there's nothing spontaneous about these killings. We really do have to start seeing them as of equal status to any other killing, rather than the way that society kind of looks at them at the moment, as if they are not of the same status, as if they are isolated incidents, as if they are about the dynamic between 2 people. That simply isn't the case. And some of the researchers in the States have said that domestic homicides are the most preventable, the most predictable. So we should be taking that message. I say we, everybody in this call now probably does, but the system itself needs to recognise that this isn't about an argument between 2 people. So after we did the homicide timeline, we then did some research to produce the domestic abuse suicide timeline. Now, we haven't really had any awareness raising for this piece of research yet, but we will be doing that. And it's very interesting to look at the suicide timeline and see how risk escalates, not only in the behavioural patterns of the perpetrator, but the risk is escalating in the way that the victim is responding to those behavioral patterns. And going along with other research that has been done into domestic abuse related suicides before now, we found that entrapment, that feeling that you're never going to escape this, you are completely trapped by this, was the most prominent behavioral characteristic of the victim prior to them taking their own life. But also, when we talk about hidden homicides, I'm sure you will all appreciate that some suicides are in fact staged. And we have found it quite useful to compare the timelines to consider whether something looks like a suicide because of domestic abuse or a homicide that has been staged as a suicide because the behavioural patterns of the victim are quite different in some cases. So what we also did with help from some specialist researchers was to then have a look at the way coercive control and the behavioural patterns play out in honour killings. And all of these timelines are, you know, they're related to each other because we're always talking about coercive control, really. And coercive control is at the heart of the suicides, of the homicides, and of the honour killings. So this is another timeline we haven't yet been able to raise much awareness about, but the research is available to look at if you want to have a look at it. So again, we have escalation points happening in honour killing that have relationships to suicide and homicide, and we also looked at honour suicides as well, which is something that is not talked about a lot at all. And there are, of course, similarities between those honour suicides and entrapment and coercive control. The latest piece of work that we are doing, and this is not published, I haven't spoken about this research at all until today, so I'm just putting it out there because it's something that I have been involved in. Recently, I've been involved in 3 cases as an expert witness where women have killed their abusers, and the criminal justice system treats women who kill their abusers absolutely deplorably. So, you know, taking certainly some of the things that I learned from working on those cases and having a look at other cases, there have been some very high profile ones where women have killed their partners, and there does seem to be, again, a pattern to these things, and a pattern tightly related to coercive controlling patterns and to victim responses to those patterns. Well, sometimes victims respond by standing up for themselves or trying to free themselves, and the criminal justice system really isn't very good at accepting those defences. So we are hoping if we can complete this piece of research that might have some impact on our criminal justice system. So I'm now just going to, I'm rushing through this. I'm now just going to talk about the hidden homicide research, because that again is so tightly intertwined with those timelines and with those behavioural patterns. So hidden homicides, what are they? Really, we're talking about the failure to identify a suspicious death. And as I said in the beginning, this happens a lot more than we imagine. And when I started to look at some of the research that had been done into the barriers to professionals being able to tell when something's suspicious or whether it isn't, it became even more interesting. These things have been raised before. Forensic pathologists, for example, had expressed concern that not enough deaths were being referred to them for forensic postmortems, and forensic postmortems, of course, are more expensive. But if they're not even alerted, and we're just doing the standard post-mortem. A standard post-mortem is not really of much use to us if we're going to enter the criminal justice system. And, you know, the first task of any police officer attending any call of any crime is to establish if a crime has been committed. That's not always as easy as it seems, and I am certainly not saying, you know, the police need to up their game completely. Sometimes it is difficult, but sometimes you just need to be open to your professional curiosity. And if you know what these timelines look like, if you know what the escalation patterns are, then the suspicions might become clearer. There is, in fact, very little training in this area, and quite often the person at the scene of a crime who might be making that decision is not going to be a senior investigating officer, is not going to be somebody who's trained in this kind of thing. But one of the most awful things, I think, from my experiences working with bereaved families, is how a hasty narrative can travel through the system and direct the response of all of the other agencies and stages that follow it. And sometimes it is only the family who are constantly expressing their suspicions and expressing the things that they would like done. So this hasty narrative, I'm just going to talk about that in some cases in just a second. So this is what has been found from previous research into the process of homicide investigation. So despite increases in forensic capability, clear-up rates for homicide have fallen, certainly in the United States, and I think we're probably finding the same kind of thing here. In fact, if we have a look at this from Roberts, they've fallen to 61% compared to 92% in 1960. We think we're getting better. Actually, we're not. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The CSI effect, and, you know, juries are expecting that there's DNA evidence in every case, and they think that DNA can say things that it can't necessarily say. So that it's a very complex thing. And certainly the development of the murder investigation manual is great, and that document is really, really interesting, but nobody will even look at the murder investigation manual if a sudden death isn't deemed to be suspicious. So we don't get all of that expertise coming in at all. So, you know, those perhaps non-specialist officers making those initial decisions, if they haven't been trained very well in coercive control, they may not be making those calls. So some of the issues: a victim's social status impacting on the rigour with which a crime is investigated. Yes, that has been found in research, but it also impacts on whether it is considered a crime has been committed at all. There is a failure to listen to families and to witnesses. There are organisational pressures, and workloads are often unmanageable. Confirmation bias, where you look at something and you think, well, I know what happened here, you know, illicit drug use, or maybe somebody has mental health issues, and then an immediate narrative is formed, and agencies are not very good at revisiting a hasty decision, and they can be sometimes very hurried and rapid. So some of the areas for concern then: staged suicide, definitely. Accidents, we know, we have seen cases recently where even car accidents have been found to be murders. There's the falls being investigated by Louise Tickle. Suicides preceded by domestic abuse, sex games gone wrong. They are trying to address that. Missing person, the damaging narrative that you know, that says, oh, well, this person was a drug user or whatever. Mercy killings are just written off all the time, and suicide pacts. So there's lots of context in which a homicide can actually appear to be something else, or can appear to be justifiable or excusable. So very, very quickly, just some case studies that we have looked at, just to tell you the kinds of things that are concerning us. So in this particular case, a young woman had packed all her bags. She had been in a terribly abusive relationship with this man. She'd packed her bags. She was about to leave, and suddenly she's dead. Now, he phoned for the ambulance 40 minutes after she died, and said she'd had suffered an epileptic seizure, had managed to tangle herself up in the bed sheets, and had died. Well, the paramedics turned up, and the paramedics, and this is another area for concern, you can see it in the paper we're writing, the paramedics took him at his word and started to work on Emily, even though I think they knew she was dead. Shouldn't have said her name, but I've said it now, sorry. So they took her to the hospital. The police never even attended that scene, ever, because it was never flagged up to them. It was only flagged up to the police like 9 months later, I think, when the family approached us. And some terrible, terrible things had happened to the evidence, and they were unable to even start an investigation in there, really, even though they found that this particular person had a second suspicious death in their history. Another one, an elderly woman suffering with dementia. Now, this is a very, very difficult situation as well, because people don't listen to people with dementia. They don't necessarily listen to the families, and it can become incredibly difficult. When this woman died, nobody raised any red flags at all, except a family member, who then became the problem herself. She was the problem, not the perpetrator. And they did find, after I think 3-4 years of fighting, they found after a second post-mortem that there were drugs in that woman's body that should not have been there and cannot be explained by any of the medication that she was under. In this case, the victim was said to have caused herself catastrophic head injuries falling from a sofa. That was a death attended by the police, but was considered to be an accident, despite some of the bruises on the victim that could not be explained by falling off the sofa, like a bite mark on her back. In this case, a woman was said to have stabbed herself to death. There was a child witness to that murder. Nobody listened to that child. And it wasn't until 3 years later that the police decided to investigate, when the child just would not stop talking about it. In that case, there has been a charge of murder now, and it is about to go into the criminal justice system. So I just hope that long time period in between where they didn't collect any forensic evidence, I hope that's not going to have too much of an impact. I've spoken about the case of Katie Wilding before. Katie was the victim of the most horrific abuse, and her abuser took his life at the same time she lost her life. She died through a massive overdose of illicit drugs, but she was not a drug taker, and they had proved that in the post-mortem through hair samples that she wasn't. But at this point, the police will still not investigate, maybe because he's dead as well. So these are the kinds of cases that we're talking about. I'm going to very quickly move on now to the third piece of work that we've just done. Actually, we've completed this piece of work, and we were looking at whether there was anything to be learned, not from a homicide review, but from cases where professionals considered that they had stopped a death, they had prevented a homicide, so a near miss. And I'm not talking about near misses where medical intervention has saved somebody's life. I'm talking about where professionals themselves have intervened and, in their opinion, have prevented a homicide. That was such an interesting piece of work. We looked at over 100 cases, and it was about 120 cases where a death was considered to have been prevented. All of those deaths were related to domestic abuse, honour killing, or coercive control. And the results were consistent, in fact. And the most important thing that came out of that research was that every single participant, so we had police officers, we had IDVAs, we had mental health workers, we had lots of different people who had become involved. And every single one of them said that the answer was advocacy. They didn't always use that language. Some absolutely did use the language of advocacy, using that terminology, but a lot of them would say things like standing up for the victim, fighting for the victim, challenging decisions that were being made in that victim's name. So that was really interesting, and we produced the advocacy wheel, which I do have on one of these. Oh, there it is. Didn't realize it was coming up next, but this is the advocacy wheel. So it's, at the top of that, everybody said offender management is the key issue. If you can manage the offender, you can safeguard the victim. But offender management is also claimed to be the most difficult thing. We can't do anything, we can't lock people up, we can't this, we can't that, but there are things we can do. And when offenders were managed, the outcomes were much better. And victim engagement, so building that rapport with a victim, listening to them, you're more likely to get their buy-in to whatever you need to do to manage the offender. Coordination was a big thing because, in many of these cases, there were, I think, what we could call complex needs. So a lot of the cases were related to culture. A lot were related to illicit drug use or mental health problems. So it can be very, very difficult for a victim to coordinate all of the different agencies that might be involved in the response to their disclosure of domestic abuse, and they need some help with that. The professionals were finding it difficult, but challenge was the biggest one. This is one that came up that everybody talked about, challenging decisions. So sometimes a decision would be made based on the policy of that particular agency. But what we found was, talking about these cases, often the decision made was a misinterpretation of the policy, but because they had confidently said, this is our policy, that wasn't questioned. But in those cases where a decision was challenged, and I don't mean necessarily having a stand-up fight with somebody, but saying, is there any way around this? Can we have a look at the wording of the policy? Is there anything that we can do? And challenging policy actually, in a lot of cases, meant that decisions were reversed or changed in the favour of the victim. We saw some innovative practice as well. Obviously, I could go on about this all morning, but I simply don't have the time. But then the better the advocacy is, the better the offender management. And so it kind of goes round in this circle. But one thing that we did notice was that the word advocacy is disappearing and being replaced by kind of support instead of advocacy. So domestic violence support, or I can't think of the word, but we're kind of moving back from the word advocacy because it's difficult, probably more expensive, and needs a lot more from the leadership and from the supervisors. Supervisors need, this is what came from this research, supervisors need to support people so that they can advocate. And that comes from then the leadership. The messages from the leadership need to be that we are not just supporting people and giving them advice, we're helping them coordinate something that they may never have experienced before and don't know of all of the things open to them. But that again is that piece of research is available, and it was done via the Home Office. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the application of some of these things that we've been looking at. So the application of behavioural patterns. So personally, we are applying that through expert reports for court, where it's being applied in homicide and suicide reviews to track those chronologies. It's being used in investigative support, identifying evidence and where that evidence might be and how to collect that evidence. We're looking at risk escalation assessments and response protocols. So how should we respond? Well, it may depend. If you're at stage 6, 7 or 8, your response needs to be a lot more intense and maybe a lot more urgent than if you're maybe at some of the lower stages. So we're seeing lots and lots of different ways that behavioural patterns can be used and are actually telling people that this is a legitimate forensic area for research and for response. We were quite happy to look at the forensic approach when we're talking about serial killers and mass killers and things like that. It's time we use that same approach.
Jane, you've gone on to mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep,
Yeah. Oh, I don't know what that was then. I'm nearly done, everybody. Honestly, I've got 5 minutes and I'll be done. Right, yes. So the application of behavioural patterns is like giving the status to domestic abuse that this is a legitimate area for research and you can't ignore us anymore and you can't tell us this is just about arguments. For policy and practice, sudden or unexpected death investigation. We've got to up our game here. We have to be aware of our confirmation bias when we look at domestic abuse and think, oh, I know what's happened here. This is this or this is that. Professional curiosity comes up all the time, doesn't it? Revisit decisions, follow all reasonable lines of inquiry. Look for that evidence early, lock down the scene first. And then if it comes to it that it's not suspicious, fine. But if you're just going with it's not suspicious until you prove to me that it is, you've lost all that potential for evidence collection. And we really do not need to start thinking about history and timelines when we're looking at these abusers. And responses to disclosure. Let's have a look at the risk escalation. We already do risk assessments, advocacy. Let's go in thinking this person, this victim is going to have a problem getting through this system. We're going to help them rather than we're just going to support them. And I'm not talking about IDVAs, I'm talking about everybody. I'm talking about all professionals, because all professionals in our research said they wanted to advocate, and those were the cases where they did advocate, where they prevented homicides. It's the supervision and the leadership, as I've said, and the status of the issues. Domestic abuse needs more status. Evan Stark said that. He said, if you want to get rid of it, raise the status of it. And that's something I feel so passionate about. Let's stop looking down on domestic abuse as a women's issue or something that we don't really need to talk about. Let's get it up there as a serious societal problem, which it is. Advocacy I've talked about, not the same as support. It goes beyond. It needs the supervision and the leadership. It needs the training, and it needs for that victim to, the professional to feel that they will be supported if they challenge decisions. We know about the tools, so there's just there's lots of tools that we can use as well. And finally, domestic abuse, coercive control and stalking are killers. The numbers are higher than we acknowledge. These are not isolated incidents. All of these deaths are related. The suicides, the homicides, the hidden homicides, all related, the honour killings. They're not crimes of passion. We can, and we are preventing deaths. I know all of you out there are doing that. And we can, and we are delivering justice, but we've got to do better, and we've got to raise the status of the issues. Having said we need to do better, that was in full recognition of the brilliant stuff that you are doing. And I think I'm finishing bang on time, actually. So I'm going to stop presenting now and hand back to Marcia, I think.
Hi Jane, just coming back to me for the moment. Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely wonderful. It's so good to hear about the specific case studies, about the research, and then bringing that to that practical implementation, what we need to do. Yeah, absolutely everyone here is doing amazing work, but having that insight into what we need to do to recognise all these hidden homicides of women and children, the hidden domestic abuse killings, and what we absolutely as professionals need to be focusing on at a strategic level, at a decision making level, training, implementation, and everyone needs to be on board with that, not just the IDAs and the IDVAs. And yeah, absolutely amazing. And you also helped us recoup a little bit of late running there as well. So thank you, Jane. You're always impeccable with your timing. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a little break so that people can get a little refocus of your eyes away from the screens. So we're going to have a wee 10-minute break, and before we have a break, after we have a break, we're going to hear from some more speakers. If anyone has got any burning questions or thoughts, you can either tweet us or you can email us on the link that you got when you registered, and we can make sure that the speakers get those questions. But for the meantime, if you just want to have a wee 10-minute break, grab a coffee, and we will see you soon.